Okay, you've all heard enough about success. It's time for a good dose of reality. This slide is used in a number of circumstances over many different talks, and it holds it's what's in the middle that changes. The Mars Surveyor program and faster, better, cheaper, let me call it syndrome of the 1990s. It was an era that was occasioned by a very dynamic leadership in NASA. Now, let's go on to the next one. Yeah. It was occasioned by a finding out of the Antarctic, something called the Allan Hills meteorite, LH 84001, which many of you are probably familiar with. This was a meteorite which many years later, in fact in the 1990s, was discovered to have something that some thought was a potential sign of life on Mars. And it was known that this meteorite was from Mars because the chemistry of it matched the Viking signatures from the 1970s. And it doesn't match anything from the moon, from asteroids, or from Venus. So it was pretty sure from Mars. So this started a whole thought process of life on Mars, and let's focus on it. And the first player of these three amigos here, Dan Goldin. And many of you have had experiences with Dan, a very dynamic individual, very convincing, particularly with his hand around your neck. Dan is dynamic, there's no question about it. And his philosophy was, let's fill the skies with lots of small satellites. No more Battlestar Galacticas. And Battlestar Galactica was just a code name for the Cassini mission, which you heard about this morning. He thought it was too big, too long, too much resources, so we're going to go small. And the infamous faster, better, cheaper mantra was developed with this thought that would fill the skies with small satellites. And the theory of that has some merit to it. And you've heard some talks here about how faster, better, cheaper approach has worked. The Lunar Prospector, and Andy was just talking about some aspects of the NEAR mission. So there are elements of it that are reasonable and appropriate. There are also elements of it that can be inappropriate and unreasonable. And the next player down here, Ed Stone of the Jet Propulsion Lab at the time of the Mars 98 missions, essentially was told to take a hands-off approach to the management of what was named the Mars Surveyor program. The Mars Surveyor program was envisioned as a series of 5 missions, essentially 2 years apart, in which duplicate spacecraft, an orbiter and lander at each opportunity, would be flown to Mars to mount a real campaign to work on, primarily on the issue of, is there or was there ever life on Mars? So Ed was challenged in 2 ways. He understood even at the time that a tight management, the management scheme proposed for the Mars Surveyor program was not the right program, and yet the pressure from Dan Goldin to implement this program in this mode was significant. There was also a factor at the time and during the mission that JPL was, and even today the centers remain sometimes in competition with one another, but they had APL also at the time saying, we can do things better and cheaper than the NASA centers can. So that was also in the background. And when the thought of asking for more money for Mars 98 came up, Ed said, no, we promised headquarters that we would do it for this price, and we're committed. And indeed, they were. The third player here, myself, we had the team at Lockheed Martin Marietta at the time, And you can legitimately ask the question, what were you people thinking of? And by you people, I mean the management chain here, not the technical folks who had to implement the mission. And there's a real distinction there. We had, a year or two before that, lost a proposal called MEASURE. MEASURE never flew. It was a network type mission of lots of spacecraft going to Mars to establish a network. So after you've lost one, you say, okay, we've got to get competitive. And so you do everything you can in proposing to reduce your costs in a reasonable, and I avoid the term buy-in because it was not that, but you think of ways that you can legitimately get cost out of a mission. And there are ways. They may not be practical. For example, we said we can put a lot of new hires on this mission. New hires are de facto less expensive. They're at starting salaries. And you tend to forget in the proposal stage that the new hires don't know how to do things. And that you need experienced people to guide those people. So as the mission went on, it became imperative that we had higher priced people to help guide, both do the mission and mentor some of the newer folks. So all these things conspired to set up a system that had failure, as you will, sort of built in. At the time, it was not recognized. We thought, yes, we can do it. We and JPL, John McNamee, Ed Euler, our project manager, thought, yes, there is a way to do this, and we can do it. So there was conviction. The folks on the mission, the technical people, worked their butts off to bring these missions about. And you've heard several other people discuss overworking a project, and that if you had a little more time and more manpower, you'd relieve some of that pressure. This was, in my view, the ultimate pressure vessel for the technical team that was doing everything within their power to make these missions work. If we have the next, please. Now, the Mars 98 was the first of what was to be a 5-series mission set to Mars. The budget was essentially that for one mission. If you look at other missions underway at the time, say Stardust or missions at other centers, this was a twofer. And you say, how did you think you could possibly do that? Commonality of hardware and software between the orbiter and lander was one of the approaches. It was also realized that, no, we did not have to quote, make money on these first ones. It was a series of 5. We'll take our losses early on and recover in the second, third, fourth, fifth mission sets. So that was not an immediate concern. A challenge, obviously. There were 2 major failures on the mission, of course. The Mars Climate Observer, which was the first one, it went in low into the Martian environment, and low meant you went into the atmosphere and you became a lander. And that is not good for an orbiter. A communication problem was a piece of the missing information. During the mid-course correction, one of them, it became evident that something was wrong at that time. The nav team said, not to worry. The project, McNamee and Euler and the rest of the project were very concerned about it. Said, don't worry. We understand what we're doing. Been there. Relax. Shouldn't have relaxed. The point there is, if you don't feel right about a decision, pursue it relentlessly and don't accept somebody else's word that everything is all right. It may not be. The lander was a different question. By the way, this was a software-related problem on the spacecraft. The lander delivered also, as well as itself, 2 probes, Deep Space 2, that were carried on the carrier structure of the lander, released just prior to entry for the EDL sequence for the lander. Neither of those probes was heard from again. The root cause of the problem of the probes was never determined. They were put on rather rapidly, so we don't know whether it was a problem in the probes themselves or whether it was related somehow to the lander problem itself. So there were 4 total. Now the root causes, I'm not going to go into the detail of them, but the proximate causes were technical. And you hear this frequently. So this part of the system doesn't work, it's a software error, it's a hardware problem. Rarely are those the real root cause. What you find, and I had good discussions with John Cassani on this, and John really brought this point home. The real ones are very frequently tied up in the management. You'll find that signs were there during the mission. Challenger and Columbia are other good examples of that. That had people been properly alert, the problem would not have happened. Here in the case of the lander, it was a matter during the test phase, back in the assembly of the ATLO process, of inadequate retesting of the landing system, and the most likely problem during landing was during the deployment of the legs and potential signal to the lander computer saying, I have landed, when it was really the shock of the leg deployment and not a touchdown. So those were the so-called proximate causes, but the real causes, again, were back in how the mission was implemented, and the faster and cheaper certainly was true. They both were faster and cheaper. Clearly not better. Next, please. The failure reviews, Tom Young was the chief inquisitor on this, and Tom is a fantastic person for doing failure reviews. He calls himself now the Darth Vader of NASA. And it's not fun, and it's not meant to be fun. But Tom very succinctly really summed things up. He said, look, you had a schedule that was tight. You had a window. You had to meet it. You didn't have any option. There was no slack in the schedule, which was tight to start with. The science payload was fairly much fixed. In fact, some things were added to the science payload as we went along. The cost was unbelievably tight and fixed. Some attempts to increase the cost were rebuffed, even though we realized we needed more resources. This was about half a year before the launch. And then the launch itself, that was not an issue. The launch vehicle, we were upgraded a size in the launch vehicle. The conclusion, though, was when you put all this together, fixed science, fixed schedule, fixed and inadequate cost, inadequate margins everywhere in the system. And the result was the variable in these missions was risk. But Tom and his team concluded this, while technical were reasons why the missions actually did not function as designed, this mission, the Mars 98, was a management failure, top and center. That was accepted throughout NASA, JPL, and Lockheed Martin. The first inclination was penalize the team that did the mission. And several of us said, no, that is the wrong thing. The team went out of its way, the implementation team, to try to make this work. We, on the management side, put them under duress and pressure that prevented them from doing the job that they actually knew how to do if they had been given the right resources to do it. Dan Golden, to his credit, said, I take responsibility, and I don't want the technical teams penalized. The inclination is to hit everybody in the system with a penalty, financial or performance evaluation. And working with Ed Stone and Larry Dumas at JPL, He said, no, we are not going to do this, and our management bought off. The technical team performed the way we had asked them to. So the management was the one that was to blame. The lessons learned in this, you may say, they're so obvious. How did you need to learn the lesson? So I've said lessons painfully relearned. And many of the things you've heard during the last several days here, you say, yeah, I understand that. Yep, understand that one, learn that lesson. In the heat of the mission implementation, you tend to forget those things. So periodically taking stock and going back and say, are we doing the right things under the heat of the mission development? Try to take some time and have some people who just have what's called the aha time. Say, are we missing something? Are we doing something that doesn't make sense? Because in the heat of battle, you can get so involved that you lose sight of the larger picture and what's happening. So proposing reality, which is where all you teams are at this point, is just absolutely critical, and having those margins up front. There's a tendency to be optimistic, think, yeah, I can get away with a little less resource here or there, particularly when you're in the competitive phase and you say, we've got to beat the other team. The TIMCO and the evaluation panels can do a pretty good job of figuring out what is realistic in terms of your margins, both on mass, your power, your budget. So proposing reality has got to be number one, and will save an awful lot of pain later. Don't overly constrain that fits in right with that and the margin situation. You've heard the mantras, fly like you test and test like you fly. Those are simple and simplistic, but there's a wealth of experience and background in there. So if you hold to those two mantras, if you will, and do that, you indeed, even under a reasonably tight, but not overly tight budget, can succeed. And to demonstrate that on the last one we have here, next. The Mars Odyssey 2001, where essentially the orbiter was identical to the Mars Climate Observer. So simply getting that software problem fixed, simple little thing, led to a mission success and happiness. On the lander, the Phoenix was the 2001 lander that Ed Wilder said, no, we're not going to fly that. And that at that time was the right decision. There were a lot of things on that lander in the software and some of the hardware that were fixed after the failure reviews and during the initial part of the Phoenix mission, where they went through in detail and looked at everything you had to implement. And the whole approach to Mars entry, descent, and landing was changed so that during that whole process you have good data coming back so you know specifically what happens. So clearly the lessons did get learned, and it's a heck of a lot more fun and interesting. Here, Ed Sedevy here trying to catch flies. It is the preferred mode of mission implementation. Thank you.